My husband handed me a single suitcase on my 64th birthday and told me to pack what I could carry. The house, the land, the accounts they're mine. Dorothy, always have been. My daughter said, "Fight him." My son said, "Fight him." I smiled, zipped that suitcase shut, and walked out the front door. He opened a bottle of champagne that same night. He had no idea I'd already made a phone call that would change everything. Good evening, dear listeners. I'm Emma, and thank you for being here with me. Please like this video and stay with me until the very end, because this story doesn't go where you think it's going. Let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these words travel. Now, let me tell you about the year I lost everything and found myself. For 38 years, I was Frank Hollister's wife. We built our life in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house with a wide front porch and a garden I'd poured my heart into since we moved in the summer of 1987. 2 stories. Original hardwood, a magnolia tree in the backyard that I had planted from a sapling the year our son Daniel was born. My husband was an architect, a good one, respected in the community, the kind of man people pointed to at church and said, "There's a man who built something real." And I was a nurse for 22 years until Frank's career took off and we decided together, or so I believed, that I would step back and run the household. We had 2 children, Daniel, who lives in Asheville now and restores furniture, and Claire, my daughter, who works in marketing in Nashville and who I'd grown somewhat distant from over the years. My fault as much as hers, I think. I'd poured so much of myself into keeping Frank's life smooth that I hadn't always had enough left over. I didn't notice the signs at first because I wasn't looking. That's the honest truth. When you've been with someone for nearly 4 decades, you stop scrutinizing the small things. You stop reading the evidence. You assume a shared history protects you. I was wrong about that. The first crack came on a Wednesday morning in late October. Frank came downstairs, dressed for a client meeting in a jacket I didn't recognize. Navy blue, well-fitted, the kind a man buys to impress someone. I'd ironed his shirts every week for 38 years. I knew his wardrobe. This jacket wasn't in it. "New client," he said, before I could even ask. "Big project." He left without kissing me goodbye, which he hadn't done since the early years when he was stressed about money. We hadn't been stressed about money in a long time. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the same thing the following week when he came home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, explaining it away as a colleague who'd hugged him at the office. I told myself when I found a restaurant receipt folded in his coat pocket for a dinner for 2 at a place downtown that I'd always wanted to try, and he'd always called overpriced. He said it was a client dinner. He looked me in the eyes when he said it. I believed him. Or I let myself believe him, which is not quite the same thing. Then, in early December, Frank came to me on a Sunday evening while I was reading. He sat across from me in the armchair he'd had for 20 years. And he folded his hands in his lap, and he said the words in a voice I didn't recognize. Not cold, not cruel exactly, just empty. The way a room sounds after the furniture's been moved out. He said he wanted a divorce. I set my book down. I asked him why. He gave me the speech. The one that sounded like it had been rehearsed in a mirror or murmured into someone else's ear. He said we'd grown in different directions. He said he needed space to figure out who he was at this stage of his life. He said he cared about me. Always would. But that caring about someone and wanting to spend the rest of your life with them were 2 different things. He said all of this calmly, with the careful architecture of a man who has been planning the demolition for some time. I sat with it. I didn't cry. I asked him if there was someone else. He hesitated half a second too long, then said, "That wasn't the point." That half second told me everything. He slid a folder across the coffee table. His attorney had already drawn up terms. I felt the air leave my lungs as I read through them. the house, which was titled solely in his name because we'd bought it 3 years into our marriage when I was still working. And we'd done it in his name for reasons that made sense at the time and that I had never once thought to revisit, went to him. The investment accounts, also in his name. The property in Gatlinburg, a small rental cabin we'd bought 15 years ago as an income property, and that I had furnished, decorated, and managed the bookings for every single year, also in his name. What remained for me was a monthly stipend that would barely cover an apartment and groceries. 38 years of marriage reduced to a number that felt like an apology. He watched me read. When I looked up, he said something I will never forget. He said, "Dorothy, you'll be fine. You're a practical woman. This is the practical thing." I closed the folder. I said I would need some time to review it. He said, of course, take a week. But that his attorney had assured him the terms were more than reasonable, and that prolonged litigation would only cost us both money and peace of mind. He said he hoped I'd be smart about this. I was going to be very smart about this. Just not in the way he imagined. That night I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. I thought about the years I had given to that house, and that man, the holidays I had organized, every detail of every Christmas morning, every Thanksgiving, every birthday. Frank's mother, who had needed full-time care in her last 2 years, and who I had been the one to arrange and coordinate and visit, while Frank said he was too busy at the office. The dinner parties where I had cooked and served and smiled and made Frank look like a man with a warm and capable life. The vacations I had planned and packed for and managed while he enjoyed them. What I owned legally. My personal car. My jewelry. My clothes. A savings account with $11,000 that I used for household expenses. What I had actually built. 38 years of a shared life. The kind of invisible labor that never shows up on a balance sheet. The fear was real. At 64, with no current nursing license, no income, and a resume that hadn't been updated in over 2 decades, I was looking at starting over with almost nothing. The stipend Frank's attorney had generously offered would not cover rent in any neighborhood I'd want to live in. I knew what Frank was counting on. He was counting on me being afraid enough to sign. I was afraid. But fear and defeat are not the same thing. In the morning, I called my son Daniel. I told him straight, the way I'd always spoken to him, without softening. He went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom, tell me what you need." I told him I didn't need money, not yet. I needed a name, not a divorce attorney, not yet. I needed someone who understood hidden assets. He called me back within an hour with the name Rebecca Marsh, an estate and asset litigation attorney out of Nashville, who had spent 20 years untangling exactly the kind of financial arrangements that benefited the person who held all the titles. "She's not cheap," Daniel said. "She's also not the kind of person who loses." I used my household savings account to pay the consultation fee and drove to Nashville on a Thursday morning, feeling more purposeful than I had in years. Rebecca Marsh was a small woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a calm that reminded me of the best doctors I'd worked with in my nursing years. The kind of calm that isn't indifference, but precision. She listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me one question. She said, "How well do you know your husband's business finances?" I told her I managed our personal accounts and had a general awareness of his firm's financial health, but that Frank had always handled the professional side separately. I said that I'd noticed over the past 2 years that the deposits into our joint account had become smaller even as Frank mentioned new projects and contracts. I said I'd chalked it up to business overhead. I said the word overhead with the slight embarrassment of someone who realizes they'd accepted an explanation without ever examining it. Rebecca leaned forward. She said that in her experience, when a spouse begins systematically reducing what flows into shared accounts, in the years before initiating a divorce, it is rarely a coincidence. She said she wanted to pull business records, property filings, and LLC registrations associated with Frank's firm and his name going back 5 years. I asked if she could actually do that. She said Tennessee is a community property adjacent state with equitable distribution principles, and that marital assets acquired during the marriage belong to both spouses, regardless of whose name is on the title. She said that what his attorney had handed me was not a legal settlement. It was a bluff, dressed up in legal language. I drove home differently than I had driven down. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I hadn't been in a long time. Observant. Methodical. I went through every filing cabinet in Frank's study, photographing documents with my phone. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just patterns. I noticed references to an LLC I didn't recognize. Hollister Development Partners, registered 3 years ago. I noticed transfers to an account associated with that LLC that didn't correspond to any project I'd heard Frank mention. I sent everything to Rebecca. Meanwhile, I played the role Frank expected. Quiet, considering, occasionally mentioning the paperwork and asking gentle, clarifying questions that I framed as confusion rather than investigation. He was patient with me in the way powerful people are patient when they believe the outcome is already decided. He was even kind, in a distant way, like a man who has already emotionally moved out. I noticed other things too. The new phone he kept face down on the table. The evenings he said he was working late that left him arriving home with the particular brightness of someone who has just left somewhere they'd rather be. I didn't say anything. I filed everything away. Rebecca called me on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after our first meeting. She said, "I need you to sit down." Then she told me what she'd found. Frank had established Hollister Development Partners as a private LLC 3 years ago. Through that entity, he had purchased 2 investment properties, one in Chattanooga and one just outside of Asheville. Using money transferred from business revenues that should have been reflected in our joint marital income. The estimated combined value of those properties was just under $600,000. In addition, Rebecca had flagged a pattern of reduced personal draws from his firm over the same period, consistent with deliberately suppressing the income figure that would be used to calculate support payments in a divorce. He'd been planning this, I said. My voice sounded strange to me. Flat. At least 3 years, Rebecca said. Possibly longer. Dorothy, this isn't just aggressive asset protection. What he's done constitutes intentional dissipation of marital assets. In Tennessee, courts take that seriously. It doesn't just affect what you're owed. It affects how a judge views the entire case. I asked if we could prove it. She said they already had. The property records were public. The LLC filings were public. The financial trail, once you knew where to look, was not subtle. She said Frank had hidden it behind business complexity, counting on the assumption that I wouldn't look and wouldn't know where to look if I did. He had forgotten that I had spent 22 years as a nurse. I was professionally trained to notice what people were trying not to show. That evening, Frank came home from the office and found me making dinner. He asked, casually, if I'd had any more thoughts about the agreement. I said I had a few questions. He sat at the kitchen island, relaxed, and said, "Of course, what's on your mind?" I asked him about Hollister Development Partners. The silence was very brief. "But I've worked in emergency rooms. I know how much information lives in a half-second pause." He said it was a business venture. Nothing that affected personal finances. Not relevant to the divorce proceedings. His voice was even. Practiced. I thought to myself, he's had this conversation in his head. He was ready for me to find it. He just wasn't ready for what came next. I told him Rebecca Marsh had the property deeds for both the Chattanooga and Asheville properties, along with 3 years of LLC transfer records. I told him she had already filed a motion to include those assets in the marital estate. His composure didn't shatter. It shifted. The warmth, whatever artificial warmth he'd been maintaining, drained out of his face. And what replaced it was the expression of a man recalculating, not regret. Recalculation. He said I was making a mistake. He said his attorneys would challenge everything Rebecca filed. That I didn't understand how long and how expensive this process was going to get. That by the time it was over, I would have spent everything I had and gotten less than he was already offering. He said all of this quietly, almost gently, the way you explain something difficult to someone you've decided isn't very intelligent. I told him I'd see him in court. He stood up, and for one moment, I saw something else pass across his face. Not anger, not calculation. Something that looked almost like grief. He opened his mouth as if to say something that wasn't tactical. And I thought for just a second that I recognized the man I had married. Then he closed it, nodded once, and went upstairs. That night, I called Claire. We hadn't spoken in 2 months. She answered on the second ring. And when I told her what was happening, what Frank had done, and what I had done in response, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, I knew something was wrong. He called me last month. He told me you were struggling with the transition." I thought he meant emotionally. He was trying to manage the narrative with the children before I could tell them the truth. That hurt more than most things he'd done. Claire drove up from Nashville the next morning. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I showed her the documents Rebecca had sent. The property records, the transfer history. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at me and said she was sorry she hadn't been closer this past year. She said she was here now. She asked me what I needed. I told her I needed her to trust the process and not let her father convince her that I was acting out of bitterness. I told her this wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about the truth. Daniel drove in from Asheville 2 days later. He and Claire sat in my kitchen, and we went over everything together. Daniel was furious in the quiet way he's always handled things. Inward, contained, but unmistakable. He said Dad put his name on everything from the beginning. "Mom, did you know that?" I said I had trusted him. I said I hadn't thought to check. I said that was a lesson I would spend the rest of my life passing on to every woman I knew. The lesson isn't about distrust. It's about awareness. Knowledge of your own financial life isn't suspicion. It's protection. I hadn't protected myself because I'd believed love was the same as security, and it isn't. Love can change. A deed doesn't change unless you sign something. Frank retained 2 attorneys. His first formal response to Rebecca's filing was aggressive motions challenging the inclusion of Hollister Development Partners in the marital estate, arguing the properties were business assets, not personal ones. Rebecca had anticipated every argument. She had been doing this for 20 years. What Frank hadn't anticipated was that his own business partner, a man named Gerald Hutto, who had worked alongside Frank for 15 years, had grown uncomfortable with what he was being asked to sign off on. Gerald called Rebecca's office voluntarily. He provided internal records showing that the Hollister Development Partners properties had been pitched internally as a personal investment vehicle disguised as a business entity, and that he had raised concerns about the structure at the time of formation and been told to let it go. I had met Gerald Hutto at firm Christmas parties for 15 years. He had a wife named Lorraine who made incredible pecan pie and who had always been kind to me. I think about that sometimes, about the ways ordinary decency shows up in extraordinary moments. The pretrial mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday in April. By then, 5 months had passed since Frank had handed me that folder. I had spent those months building a case, but I had also spent them building a life. I had rejoined the local garden club. I had signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd mentioned wanting to do for 20 years while life got in the way. Small things, but they mattered. I was remembering what I liked. I was remembering who I was, outside of the role I'd filled for so long. The morning of mediation, I dressed carefully in a blue blazer I'd bought for the occasion. Not because the clothes mattered legally, but because I wanted to feel like myself walking into that room. 64 years old, and I had never felt more certain of who I was. Frank was already there when we arrived. He looked tired. The past months had cost him too. I could see that. His attorneys had clearly advised him that the case was not going in his direction. And it showed in the set of his jaw, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands. He looked across the table at me when we sat down, and I saw it again, that brief flicker of something that might once have been the man I loved. I acknowledged it. I didn't let it move me. The mediator walked through the situation methodically. Rebecca presented the full marital estate as documented. The family home, valued at just over $400,000. The retirement and investment accounts. The 2 Hollister Development Partners properties. Frank's business interest in the firm. Gerald's testimony and documents had made the LLC assets indefensible as anything other than marital property. Frank's attorney attempted one last negotiation. They offered 60% of the documented assets in exchange for dropping any claims against the business entity. Rebecca excused herself, conferred with me briefly, and came back with our counter. 100% of what was legally owed. Not 60, not 70. What the law said I was entitled to. There was a long silence. Frank looked at his attorneys. His lead attorney said something quietly. Frank looked at the table. Then he looked at me. He said, "Dorothy." I said, "Frank, I've been reasonable for 38 years. Rebecca spoke before anyone else could. She laid out what a full trial would look like for Frank. The Hollister properties being dissected in open court. Gerald's testimony on record. The suppressed income figures. And one more thing she had held in reserve, because Rebecca Marsh is the kind of attorney who holds things in reserve. She had the phone records. Specifically, she had documentation subpoenaed from Frank's business phone showing several hundred communications over 18 months with a woman named Sylvia Crane, who was an interior designer. Frank had met through a project in 2021. I had suspected as much. Confirmation still landed like a stone dropped into still water. In Tennessee, marital fault does not determine property division. Rebecca had told me that clearly from the beginning, but it does matter to a judge's perception of the overall picture. A man who hid $600,000 in real estate, suppressed his income, and was conducting a prolonged affair while handing his wife a folder, telling her to be grateful that man does not look sympathetic in front of a Tennessee judge. Frank accepted the terms. The final settlement gave me the family home outright. The title transferred fully into my name, with the existing mortgage satisfied from the marital asset pool. I received 55% of all retirement and investment accounts. The Hollister Development Partners properties were to be liquidated, and I would receive 55% of the net proceeds, accounting for the court's finding of intentional dissipation. Frank would pay spousal support for 8 years, reflecting the duration of my career interruption and the years I would need to rebuild financial independence. He would cover all legal fees, which at that point were substantial. I sat outside the building afterward in the April sunshine with Rebecca beside me. She said, "You did that. You stayed focused for 5 months when most people crack." I told her I had been scared every single day. She said she knew. She said most of the women who come out the other side say the same thing. The drive home that evening was different from every drive I'd taken in the previous 5 months. I felt the particular quiet of something finally being done. Not happiness. Not yet something closer to solid ground. Daniel met me at the house with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. Claire came up from Nashville, and we sat on the porch until late in the evening, wrapped in blankets, talking the way we hadn't talked in years. My daughter told me things she'd held back because she hadn't wanted to worry me. I told her things I'd held back because I'd been trying to protect her. We had both been protecting each other into distance. We agreed to stop doing that. I lived in the house for 6 more months. Then I sold it. I know how that sounds after everything I'd gone through to keep it. But the truth is that a house is not a home when the memories inside it are more painful than the walls are warm. I had won the right to stay. I chose to go, and that choice felt more powerful than anything else I'd done. I bought a small craftsman bungalow 20 minutes outside of Knoxville, closer to the river, with a fenced backyard big enough for the garden I had always wanted to plant on my own terms. I paid cash. From the settlement, the title is in my name. Only mine. I have checked it 3 times. I will probably check it again. Claire helped me pick out paint colors. Daniel built me new bookshelves along the entire east wall of the living room. I have watercolors framed in the hallway. Not good ones, but mine. I am taking a drawing class now too. I have a standing coffee date on Friday mornings with 2 women from the garden club, Ruth and Patricia, who are both in their 70s, and who have both been through their own versions of starting over, and who make me laugh until I can't breathe. I started teaching financial literacy workshops at the community center, 2 Wednesdays a month. Women only, all ages, but mostly women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, women who are married and comfortable, and who have, as I did, trusted their partners to handle the paperwork. I am gentle about it. I tell them it isn't about distrust. I tell them it's about knowing the life you've built, having your name on it, understanding what you own and what you owe and what you're entitled to. It's about being a full participant in your own financial life, not because something bad is coming, but because you deserve to know. Frank finished the settlement process and moved into a condo downtown. I heard through Daniel that he and Sylvia had dated for about 4 months before she ended things. I did not feel glad about that. Not exactly. I felt the way you feel when you've been very hungry and then you've eaten and you realize you don't need anything more from the situation. I heard he is still working, still designing buildings, doing good work, probably. I think he always was skilled at his profession. I think people can be genuinely talented at their work and still be capable of great harm in their personal lives. Those things can coexist. I've made my peace with the complexity of that. One morning, in early spring, I was in my backyard planting the first seedlings of the year, kneeling in the dirt with my hands deep in the soil, and I thought about the woman who had received that folder on her birthday 8 months before, the one who had sat in her dark kitchen and inventoried what 38 years had amounted to and found herself terrified. I thought about her and felt something that wasn't pity, not quite, more like tenderness. She did the right thing. She didn't collapse. She made a phone call instead. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like a woman writing down a name on a notepad at her kitchen table at midnight and deciding that scared isn't the same as finished. I am 65 now. I wake up in my own house, in a bedroom painted the exact shade of blue I chose myself, and I drink coffee on the back porch, while the garden does what gardens do. I have a trip to the Smoky Mountains planned for this fall with Claire and Daniel and my 3 grandchildren. We are renting a cabin for a long weekend. I booked it. My name is on the reservation. I am not going to tell you that what happened to me was a gift. It wasn't. It was a betrayal and a loss, and it cost me more than I can fully account for. But I will tell you that what came after has been mine in a way that the years before weren't. And that matters more than I know how to say. So that's my story. A 64-year-old woman who was handed a suitcase and handed it back. What did I learn? that you can rebuild at any age. But rebuilding is easier if you know what you built in the first place. That the women in your life, the ones at church, the ones at the garden club, the ones you've lost touch with, are often the ones who will steady you when the ground moves. That a good attorney is worth every penny, and that more importantly, you are worth every penny. That the most powerful thing I ever did was not fight in a courtroom, though I did that too. It was decide, alone, at a kitchen table in the dark, that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. What would you have done with that suitcase? Please leave a comment and share this story if it meant something to you. You never know who might be sitting at their own kitchen table right now, trying to figure out their next move. Thank you for being here with me tonight. This is Emma, and I'll see you in the next story.